Hey everybody, it's Just101, and welcome to the Pokemon Bio videos for Mystery Dungeon. So, this is going to be a very in-depth, long, crazy look at how good different Pokemon are in Mystery Dungeon. I'm going to be looking at a lot of different factors, analyzing a lot. I've spent literally countless hours creating these guides and making sure you pick the best Pokemon for your game. Let me explain some stuff. I'm going to start at grass first, go to fire types, go to water types, go to all the normal types because all of those typings have multiple Pokemon in that typing, and then I'm going to go to every other typing because a few Pokemon, like there's an electric type Pokemon, there's ground type Pokemon that only have one Pokemon in that category. So I'm just going to talk about them separately and analyze which one is the best choice for you. There's a few other things I want to talk about. Every single starter Pokemon can be your main Pokemon, and there's also a partner Pokemon. So you have to choose a partner Pokemon to be with you. So any of the choices you see here can be yourself, but there are very specific choices you can choose for your partner. So for example, if I choose Bulbasaur, my partner can be any fire type, any water type, and Pikachu. Those are the only choices I get. So if I want to have a Cubone as my partner, I cannot do that. However, if I chose Cubone as my main Pokemon, I could choose any grass type, which includes Bulbasaur, any fire type, any water type, and Pikachu. So you cannot choose the same type. You can't have two of the same type on your thing, but you can have any of the combinations that are the main starter Pokemon. So the three starter Pokemon for each of the generations that are in this are Bulbasaur, Charmander, and Squirtle, Chikorita, Cyndaquil, and Totodile, and Treecko, Torchic, and Mudkip. Those are the three Pokemon that you can pair with any other Pokemon as long as they're a different typing, and it's completely fine. And Pikachu as well. Pikachu is just because he's special, you can just use him whenever. So that's something I wanted to explain. There's another concept that's going to be in this video quite a bit, and it's involving early game and late game. So I wanted to explain how the early game works. Early game is essentially the story mode of the game. So a lot of people don't realize this, but Mystery Dungeon is a very complicated and long series, and there's a lot of content that's unlocked after you beat the main story of the game. So I'm not going to spoil anything for people who don't know what that is, but the real game doesn't really start until you beat the game, essentially. So that means you have to be really careful with your choices and what you decide to do. Some Pokemon are amazing throughout the game, like a lot of fire types in particular are really, really good throughout the main story, and then a lot of them don't end up being good late game. I'm calling late game everything after the main story is done. And honestly, there's like more content in the post game, in the late game, and that's something to consider if you plan on doing that a lot. Another factor I wanted to talk about is evolution, because evolution is not possible until the late game. So there's some Pokemon that are really, really good early game because they're fine Pokemon on their own. That's an example of that is like Charmander. Charmander is a fine Pokemon to use because he really doesn't need a ton of extra stat boost until the late game. He's fine, he can stand on his own. But then some Pokemon really struggle without evolving. For example, Mudkip. Mudkip's a pretty solid Pokemon overall, but its evolution grants it a new typing that makes it really good, and you can't do that until late game. So that's something to consider. I'm going to be ranking all of these Pokemon out of 5 stars, so I have a star system right here that I can give all of these Pokemon. I'll be showing them right in the beginning of the review of that, but I will be ranking them out of 5 stars. One more other concept I'm going to explain are, there's 2 different types of moves in this game. Every single move in the game, for the most part, just affects what's right in front of you. You can attack one Pokemon that's right in front of you, that's how most moves work. However, there are certain moves that can hit opponents that are very far away. For example, if you see in Bulbasaur's little move pool here, you see at level 20 he learns Razor Leaf. Razor Leaf goes on for infinite tiles. So as long as you can see your Pokemon you're facing it, you can just attack them from range, and that makes these moves better than others. So I'm going to be specifically mentioning these whenever you see them on a certain Pokemon. Also, status moves are a very important thing to consider. So stuff like, you can see Bulbasaur learn Sleep Powder at level 15. That's something to consider because Sleep Powder puts your opponent to sleep, and it's a very, very useful move. Other moves like Smokescreen are really, really good. I'm going to be talking about those as we see them because they're very, very valuable. Out of these Pokemon in this list, 6 of them you can only use if you're a specific gender. For example, we'll get to them later, but Cyndaquil, you can only use Cyndaquil as yourself if you're male. There is no other choice. You can also only use Skitty if you're a female, as an example. I'll be talking about those as we get there, but it's a little bit of a relevant factor, so I'll be talking about that. The final concept I wanted to mention is abilities. So every single Pokemon has a unique ability that makes the Pokemon special. I'm not going to be talking about pretty much any of them because they're almost completely useless on all of these Pokemon except one. There's one exception, we'll be getting there, and it really helps the Pokemon out, but until we get there, I'm not forgetting about them, they're just not relevant on any of the Pokemon. We got through the explaining, so now we're going to be talking about the actual Pokemon themselves. There's going to be 3 different categories I'm basing these Pokemon on, and essentially I'm just going to rate my stars overall about how much I like the Pokemon. I'm going to be talking about its typing and how it affects how good the typing is for itself. I'm going to mention any gender requirements here as well. The second category I will be talking about is their early game. I'm going to be talking about their early game and how their move pool affects it. The top column list essentially is the early game list. This is all the stuff that you learn throughout the game. As you start playing through the game, you're going to get all of these moves. I'm also going to be talking about boss matchups. In the early game, boss matchups are really important because there's a lot of crazy bosses you have to fight, and a lot of Pokemon really struggle throughout this, especially because you're fighting grown legendary Pokemon with starter Pokemon, and that's something you have to consider. Certain Pokemon are going to be better at fighting these matchups. I'm going to be talking about those as we get there. The final category I'll be rating a Pokemon on is its late game potential. So this will be late game with the move pool. That bottom column are all of the moves that it can learn through TM. If you find or buy any of these moves at any point, you can give these to your Pokemon, and this ends up becoming a lot bigger of an issue late game because, for example, Bulbasaur doesn't learn a single poison type move. I mean, it learns poison powder, but it doesn't learn a damaging poison type move until post game essentially. So that's something to consider because some Pokemon end up being a lot better later because they get good moves. These are not moves that you unlock throughout the game. These are just moves you find or buy randomly. And of course, I've already mentioned this. I'm also in the late game. I'm also going to talk about evolution. Let's begin with our first Pokemon, Bulbasaur. Bulbasaur is a very well-rounded and interesting Pokemon. It has a lot to offer for the team, and it ends up being a pretty interesting choice. Bulbasaur is a grass and poison type. This means it's not a particularly great typing, but poison I think helps a lot because it gives it a lot more diverse defenses, and it rounds out the typing really nicely. I'm going to be giving Bulbasaur 3 stars. Bulbasaur I classified as a tank / support. So Bulbasaur is essentially just meant to kind of take some hits, and he ends up giving out a lot of support moves such as Sleep Powder and Poison Powder to disable your opponent, and it can tank some hits pretty well. It's not a very offensively oriented Pokemon, so if you're looking to one-shot people with Bulbasaur, this isn't really your Pokemon. It doesn't really learn a lot of great attacking moves. It learns a lot of defensive moves and can heal himself with Giga Drain and stuff like that. But you're really not meant to be an all-out attacker. You're meant to support your team and take some hits, basically. Bulbasaur's early game is pretty decent. It's a very average move pool, but it's not bad at all. It learns very solid moves, like Vine Whip is a really good move to hit your opponent with. Poison Powder and Sleep Powder are always very useful to have on a Pokemon. Razor Leaf is a ranged move, so that ends up being very useful for it. It also learns Synthesis for level up, which is really useful because it means you can heal a ton, which is really nice actually. So you don't need to carry around a ton of Aura Berries to heal yourself. Bulbasaur's move pool is very good. Bulbasaur, like every single grass type that you're going to see on this list, really struggles against the bosses. The bosses are not great early game, and there's really not a lot you can do about it except hope Bulbasaur doesn't die that much. But he's overall not a bad choice because of Sleep Powder, so he ends up helping on bosses a lot more than you might think. Bulbasaur's late game potential is definitely where he shines the most. He is kind of an average late game, but it's very solid. Bulbasaur is just an extremely solid choice. It's really not a bad thing to go with him. In the late game, he learns a lot of interesting moves like Bullet Seed. Bullet Seed is always a great move. Sunny Day can power up your fire type, so if you happen to pair Bulbasaur with a fire type, he ends up being really good in that category. He ends up getting really good healing moves through Giga Drain. Solar Beam can stack with Sunny Day, so you can instantly charge it. Sludge Bomb is amazing coverage. So it ends up getting a lot better moves late game. Its evolution is very good. Venusaur is pretty much just a straight upgrade. It doesn't really change his playstyle at all, but early game, honestly, Bulbasaur is more of a supportive mon, but late game, Bulbasaur becomes more of a tanky support mon. And being a tank support mon is really good for late game. It's not the best Pokemon overall, but it's very solid. I could not recommend Bulbasaur more. I don't think Bulbasaur is the best choice you can make, but he's certainly far from the worst. Next Pokemon up on our list is Chikorita. Chikorita is a very interesting Pokemon overall. I'm probably gonna say that for a lot of the Pokemon in this video, but Chikorita ends up being a really interesting choice. I know everybody in the comments is already, they're already typing these comments. Why did you rate Chikorita with 4 stars? That's a good question. I'm going to answer that right now. When I first used it, I didn't really like it at all. I thought it was a very weird Pokemon. It was very weak, and I didn't really like the way it played. However, now that I go back and look at it, I think Chikorita is a lot better than I once thought. Chikorita's typing is definitely its weakness, because grass, it's just a pure grass type for its entire evolution, and grass type really isn't great. It doesn't help it that much at all. There's really not a lot of good things to say here, except grass type is really weak. Also, a small note to mention is that Chikorita is a gender requirement Pokemon, so if you want to use one yourself, you need to be playing as a female. Chikorita is the definition of a support Pokemon. It has some tank capabilities, but it's really meant to be a support. It learns a lot of moves that disable your opponent, protect your team, and it ends up being a really interesting Pokemon. So early game, it actually learns really good moves. It learns Razor Leaf for long range coverage right at level 8, so that's fantastic. It ends up learning Reflect, which is a very interesting move because that raises your entire team's physical defense by a ton. But it ends up really being like a tanky mon, like helping your mons like not die. Poison Powder is fantastic to disable your opponent. It can heal itself a ton. Body Slam can cause paralysis, so it can just stack on like that kind of thing. Late Screen protects against special attack damage. It can learn Safeguard to prevent your team from getting status. And early game, it has fantastic moves. It's one of the best early game mons in terms of coverage from moves. In the early game category, however, is also one of its other biggest weaknesses. Its boss matchups are terrible, and it's because it's just a pure grass type. There's really not a lot you can do about it. It learns pretty decent moves to stop them from doing a ton of damage, such as Late Screen. Late Screen ends up being very useful for tanking a lot of that damage. Body Slam ends up being pretty useful to defend against it. Synthesis can basically just tank it up and it can just start eating up hits, but it's not the best Pokemon for taking on bosses. Chikorita also doesn't learn Sleep Powders to level up like Bulbasaur does, so that means that Chikorita is a lot weaker in the bossing department. It ends up getting moves that kind of cover that weakness, but it's not amazing. Late game is extremely similar to Bulbasaur's late game. Chikorita evolves into Meganium, and Meganium ends up getting a lot of interesting moves. They're really similar, but it ends up getting a little bit more coverage in some areas. So it still learns Bullet Seed, it learns Sunny Day and Solar Beam combo. It can learn all the screens if you got rid of them for any reason. It can learn Giga Drain. It does learn Iron Tail, which is pretty nice coverage. So that helps a lot, but overall it's a very similar move pool, and its evolution is good. It really doesn't help it that much, but overall Meganium is just a very useful Pokemon for helping your team survive. It's a pure support Pokemon. It can tank a little bit because Meganium is a naturally tanky Pokemon and it has healing moves, but Venusaur is a lot better in the tanking category. This Pokemon is just incredibly good at disabling your opponent, stopping it in its tracks, helping your team, and basically leading it to victory. And I was really surprised when I used Chikorita. I used it on my team and I was like, wow, this Chikorita's really helping me out. I was pretty surprised. So I would definitely give Chikorita a try and look into it because I think it's better than you probably think. Alright, our final grass type we're going to be looking at today is Treecko. I'm going to be rating Treecko at 3 stars. I don't think Treecko is the worst choice you can make in the game. I think he has a lot of problems and a lot of weaknesses, but he ends up being a pretty useful Pokemon overall. Starting out with its typing, like normal, grass type's really weak. It doesn't help it at all. It's just, you already know the drill, grass type isn't very good. Treecko is our first Pokemon that's classified as a DPS, and literally all this means is that Treecko is meant to dish out damage. That's its only goal. Treecko doesn't care about helping his teammates. Treecko doesn't care about getting through the dungeon quick. It doesn't matter about protecting teammates or disabling things. Treecko is just meant to go in, hit really hard, and do lots of damage. And honestly, it does that job really well. Treecko's early game is about as average as you can get. You can see its move pool right there. It's not terrible. It learns some pretty decent moves. Quick Attack is a ranged move, which is really nice. It learns Mega Drain at 26, which is pretty early, and it ends up being a really useful move. Agility can be really useful against bosses and certain enemies to defend against them. Detect is a pretty interesting level up move that can really become handy if you can predict your opponent's attacks, and it ends up learning Giga Drain, so it's actually a pretty decent thing. It doesn't really learn a lot of coverage necessarily. It also learns Pursuit, I forgot to mention, which is a pretty decent coverage move. Treecko isn't necessarily the worst early game Pokemon, but it's nothing special. It's not exactly what you're looking for. It's also a very weak bosser because it gets a few moves here and there like agility to help it out, and it can tank a little bit against certain bosses of Mega Drain, but it's not a good bossing Pokemon early game. That's not its goal. Its goal is just to not die as much as you can. At least Bulbasaur and Chikorita are kind of meant to take hits and kind of just protect the team. Treecko can only do damage. So if you're a grass type that has like only grass type moves and you can't do any damage to the bosses, then you're really not that much use. So why is Treecko rated 3 stars if I end up pretty much just bashing everything about him? This is his late game. His late game becomes substantially better because he has a very solid move pool and earns a lot of really cool cool moves. Treecko ends up getting amazing coverage with Focus Punch. Bullet Seed's a really good damage combo. It learns Sunny Day and Solar Beam if you're going for that combo. It can learn Iron Tail, Dig, Brick Break, Rock Tomb, Aerial Ace. Those are amazing coverage moves. All these coverage moves means it can cover a lot of different Pokemon in the later stages of the game. It also has a fantastic evolution. If you're looking for just a Pokemon that does lots of damage, this is your Pokemon. It does lots of damage, does it really quickly, and it's a pretty solid Pokemon overall. It's not great early, it has a really good late game, and it's basically just kind of what you want to go for. I wouldn't recommend Treecko as the highest rated Pokemon, but I would consider it. It's not a terrible choice. Charmander is the first Pokemon we're going to be rating 5 stars out of 5. Charmander is an absolutely fantastic Pokemon. I could not recommend it more to play through the game, either as your partner or yourself. Let's start with its typing. Charmander's typing is really good. Fire type is just a very solid type overall. It's really good in terms of coverage throughout the game. I'm going to be talking about this more later, but its evolution is also a very good thing. Charmander becomes a flying type. This is a very good thing. Flying type helps a lot and it covers a lot of its weaknesses really well. It just ends up being a good type overall. Charmander I have classified as a DPS/support, which is a pretty interesting pair because usually they're kind of the opposites. DPS are the people who are supposed to do lots of damage, and supports are the people who are just not supposed to do any damage and support the team. Charmander is a very interesting mix of both of these, and it's kind of an interesting Pokemon overall. The reason for this is its early game move pool. So if you look at its early game, it learns really, really good moves. So it ends up getting Ember really early, which is nice. It learns Metal Claw for coverage. It learns Smokescreen to disable your foe a lot, which is really useful in boss fights. So it ends up having a fantastic bossing type move just at level 19. It's a little bit later than some Pokemon, but Smokescreen definitely comes in handy. Scary Face is also a pretty decent disabling move if you wanted to do so. Flamethrower is a fantastic move that's ranged in this game, and it helps a lot. It also learns Dragon Range and Fire Spin, which are a little bit late in the game, but they end up being pretty useful overall. Charmander is very, very good at bossing. It just has a very good matchup of a lot of the bosses in this game. Smokescreen obviously helps a lot, and it ends up just doing a lot of damage to most of the bosses in this game. It doesn't really match up poorly against many of them. A lot of them are steel types or ice types or random types like that, and it ends up being a pretty useful Pokemon overall. However, that's not even where Charmander's best at. Charmander does have a fantastic early game, but Charmander's late game is incredible. It's pretty much one of the best late games in the entire game you can get. Charmander still keeps the DPS support tag in my opinion, but it ends up getting a little bit less supporty. It can still learn some supportive moves, but it ends up just being a lot more of a DPS. It ends up being a good DPS at that point, honestly. For coverage, it learns amazing moves. It learns Focus Punch, Dragon Claw, it learns the Sunny Day combo so it can power up its own moves if you want it to. It can learn Iron Tail, it can learn Dig, Brick Break, Aerial Ace, and Overheat, which overheats an incredibly powerful attack, so it ends up being a really good Pokemon overall. It can also learn, I don't know why it's not mentioned here, but it can also learn Heat Wave, and Heat Wave affects all the Pokemon in the room, so that ends up being a fantastic move. If you want DPS, Charmander is the way to go. And finally, to talk about its evolution, it evolves into the big bad Charizard. Everybody knows Charizard, it's not a secret. Charizard's a really awesome Pokemon overall, and Charizard ends up being really good in this game. The flying type pretty much only helps it in a lot of different categories and ends up being a really good Pokemon overall. Overall, Charmander is easily one of the best choices you can make in this entire game. I could not recommend it more. Pokemon on our list is one that I had to be very careful about reviewing because I am very biased, because Cyndaquil is my favorite Pokemon in all of Pokemon history. In the entire games, Cyndaquil is my absolute favorite, so I had to be really careful to not be biased, and I think I'm going to be really unbiased throughout this. I'm going to be rating Cyndaquil at 4 stars, and I know that's a little bit shaky, and there's some things I question about that, but this is going to be a very straightforward and simple review of Cyndaquil because he's a very straightforward Pokemon. One quick addition, Cyndaquil does need to be a male if you want to use it. You might be wondering why I put Charmander in the support category when Cyndaquil also has Smokescreen and learns that at a much earlier level. The reason I pretty much did it was because Charmander has Scary Face and it ends up being a lot more of a supportive move pool overall because it gets like 2 supportive moves right in a row. Cyndaquil, it learns Smokescreen and that's it. It just makes it so it can do more damage, honestly. It's just meant to disable your opponent so you can blast your opponent more with flamethrowers. And this is one of the things that kind of held me back from this. I'm not really sure if I think the 4-star, I think it might be close to a 3-star because its move pool sucks. It's not good. The thing is, none of the moves it learns are terrible. Like Smokescreen's obviously a very good move. It's one of the best moves it learns. It learns Ember a little bit late. It learns Quick Attack for a little bit of ranged. It learns Flame Wheel so it can do a little more damage. It learns Swift, which I haven't done my research entirely, but I believe Swift is a ranged move, and Flamethrower is a good move overall. The problem is it learns zero coverage. If you're not fighting something that's weak to fire, it's just an average Pokemon. It doesn't learn moves that can help its weaknesses at all. So if you're against something that's weak against fire, just blast it. It's great. Otherwise, it's not very good. The best way I have to describe Cyndaquil is not bad, but boring. Cyndaquil is very good at bossing just because it has smokescreen and can just blast your opponent with fire. It's pretty straightforward, there's not a lot to it. Cyndaquil's late game is also a little bit average. Honestly, honestly, I'm just gonna bump Cyndaquil down to 3 stars because I think my personal bias is pushing it to 4 stars because its late game is really average. It learns a decent amount of coverage moves, so it also gets Sunny Day like all the other Pokemon, which ends up being pretty useful for your team. It can learn Dig, Aerial Ace, that's it. That's it, that's all the coverage it learns. So Cyndaquil is a very simple job. You blast stuff with fire. That's it. That is your job as Cyndaquil. That's the only thing it does. It's pretty good at doing it, but that's its only job. Typhlosion as an evolution overall is honestly kind of average. It's not a very good Pokemon. Typhlosion is not necessarily a terrible Pokemon. It's just, it's like this. It's actually really similar to the main series as well. If you ever have used the Cyndaquil, Cyndaquil is not a very versatile Pokemon. If you're talking about a Pokemon being able to cover all of its weaknesses, do lots of different things for the team, and end up supporting your team in a lot of ways, Cyndaquil is the opposite of this idea. Cyndaquil has one job, and it does the job really well. That's why it's 3 stars, but it doesn't do anything else. It's so simple and so straightforward that it ends up being not amazing. I don't think Cyndaquil is a bad choice. You just have to know what you're doing with it because you need a Pokemon that's very well balanced to help you, because you don't want something that's also really polarizing. Like if you have certain Pokemon, like an example of a type of something that would not combine would be something like Cyndaquil and Treecko. They're both just DPS characters, and that's pretty much all their job is. If you pair Cyndaquil with something that can balance out its weaknesses really well, I think it's a good pair. But you just have to be really careful because it's not that versatile. Our final fire type we get to today is Torchic. Torchic overall is not a bad choice by any means. It has a lot more weaknesses that are exploitable compared to Charmander, but it ends up being a lot more versatile and useful than Cyndaquil. That's why I'm going to be rating it at 4 stars. I think Torchic overall is pretty decent in a lot of categories. It's one of the more average Pokemon in the game, but that doesn't end up being a bad thing. I've already mentioned this on every single other review, but fire typing is very good, helps it out a lot, good stuff, not what to say. Torchic, however, does evolve into a Pokemon that becomes a fighting type. This is a good thing, and it's kind of funny that both the fire type Pokemon that change end up being really benefiting them, but fighting type is fantastic to pair for that. I'll talk about it more later, but it's one of the best reasons to choose Torchic because it ends up being really, really good. I have classified Torchic as a DPS. It's very straightforward. It's not very supportive. It hits your opponent really hard. That's it. That's its job. And it does it well. Its early game move pool is definitely better than Cyndaquil, but it learns less coverage than Charmander. The thing about Torchic you'll learn is Torchic is kind of in the middle between both of the other fire types as a very average choice, which is not a bad thing. So its move pool ends up being pretty good. It learns pretty decent coverage of Peck, which really helps a lot. It learns Quick Attack for some range. It learns Flamethrower, which is great. And its bossing is below average. That's kind of funny because I don't necessarily think it's a terrible bosser. I think I'm just comparing it to the other fire types. The other 2 fire types end up being really good at bossing. Torchic is just okay. It ends up being a decent choice. It does a lot of damage. It's pretty good overall. Nothing really standing out about it. Here's what you're waiting for. Torchic's late game is incredible. It's easily one of the best late games in the entire game, and this is the main reason you pick it. First off, its move pool is pretty decent. It learns Dig, it learns a Sunny Day just like all the other Pokemon. It learns the Flamethrower, it learns Rock Tomb, Aerial Ace for coverage. It also learns Overheat, which is something to think about. It ends up being a really powerful attack. Good stuff to think about. The one key to the Torchic combo is getting a Blaziken. Blaziken is incredible. Firefighting is a really, really good typing overall. It covers a lot of its weaknesses really well, and fighting type is a great type to have in combination in this game in particular. Blaziken is also one of just the best starters in terms of stats. It ends up being a surprisingly tanky Pokemon that can actually take some hits pretty well, and it just dishes out so much damage. If you want a Pokemon that can just dish out a lot of damage and end up being a really solid choice late game, Torchic is your check. Overall, Torchic is a very solid choice overall. I would be a little bit careful because he struggles a little bit early game, but he's just a very solid choice. He's really average, which is fine. He's not as good as Charmander. He's not the best choice you can make, but he's also better than Cyndaquil in terms of being a DPS character. I think he's overall pretty good. We are finally onto the water types. Squirtle is a very interesting Pokemon overall because it's so simple at what it does, but it ends up being a really solid choice overall. I'm going to give Squirtle a 5-star rating. The thing about Squirtle is Squirtle doesn't particularly do anything outstanding. It's just very average in a lot of different things, but it ends up being above average in most of the categories, so it ends up just being a really solid choice. It's very similar to Charmander, where it really doesn't have a lot of weaknesses. It's just kind of a really solid Pokemon. It's not to say Squirtle is like the easiest thing just to blow through the game with, but there's really not a lot of weak points to talk about it, so I think it's a really solid Pokemon. Squirtle remains a water type throughout its evolution line, and that's fine. Water type is definitely the best type in the game in terms of just not being weak to a lot of different things, because water only has a few weaknesses, including electric and grass and stuff like that, and they're not really that common for most of the Pokemon you're going to finding in the game. So honestly, Squirtle just ends up having a really good typing. It doesn't change, so that's great. I classify Squirtle as a tank, and it's not necessarily because he learned a ton of tanky moves necessarily. He's just a Pokemon that's built to take hits. If you're noticing a theme here, I don't know if you're noticing a theme here, but usually grass types end up being more supportive, fire types end up more damaging and more DPS-y, and water types end up being a lot tankier. And that's just kind of the way it goes, and it really shows a Squirtle, because Squirtle is just a tank. He doesn't really have a lot of support moves, and he does a decent amount of damage, but he's not the most damaging Pokemon in the entire game, but he's really good at taking hits. Squirtle's early game is really solid, kind of like its entire kit. It gets decent coverage, it learns Bubble for some range damage, it learns Bite to protect itself from psychic types, it learns Protect and Rain Dance to kind of round out its little coverage. It learns Hydro Pump, which is a fantastic move. Good stuff. Squirtle is a good bosser, and it's just because he's good at tanking hits, so if you end up fighting a certain Pokemon that you need to tank hits from, hopefully if they hit Squirtle, then he'll probably be able to take them pretty well and dish out some damage. Late game, however, is one of the categories that Squirtle is not average in. He is above average in the late game. His late game move pool is really nice. That's the thing you'll also know. You'll also notice with water types that water types learn a lot of different types of moves. He has amazing moves. He can end up learning Focus Punch, which is really nice for coverage. It learns Ice Beam, which is really nice. Learning Ice Beam is fantastic. It ends up learning Iron Tail, Dig, and Brick Break for coverage. So that means it has a really solid time in terms of dealing with its weaknesses. And Blastoise is its evolution, and it ends up just being a good Pokemon overall. It becomes a lot tankier when you evolve it, because that's one of the things about this game is that most of the starters or most of the Pokemon in this game are not meant to be tanky off the bat. It's more of like they evolve and then they become tanky. Squirtle's evolution really helps it become tanky. It doesn't do a ton more damage, but it's just a really solid Pokemon overall. For a summary of Squirtle, he's just a really all-around good choice. He doesn't really stand out in a ton of different categories, but he's just a very solid choice. You really can't go wrong with them, honestly. Next up on our list is Totodile. And it's going to be a really sad review because it really sucks to say, but Totodile is pretty much just a worse Squirtle in almost every single category. And that ends up being really sad because Totodile really doesn't have a lot to stand out. I'm going to give Totodile 3 stars. Totodile's typing, I've already said this before, it stays in a pure water type its entire time, so just like Squirtle, it's fine, it's good, there's really not a lot to talk about. One of the main differences between Totodile and the other Pokemon on this list that are water type are that it's a DPS. So Totodile is really not meant to take a lot of hits. He's meant to just kind of dish out a decent amount of damage. The problem is that he really doesn't do a ton of damage. He ends up doing a good amount, but he's not that very useful. Like, he doesn't do that much damage. DPSs are a lot more well suited for the fire typing. Totodile's early game is about as average as they can get. It learns pretty decent moves. Rage is a pretty interesting move it learns. It learns some decent coverage and bite. Scary Face is pretty useful for some utility to fight opponents. It learns Hydro Pump. Its bossing is about average. It does some damage and, you know, has Scary Face to slow its opponent and, you know, it's fine. Totodile's late game coverage is exactly the same as Squirtle, so there's nothing really to talk about. It learns the exact same moves, which is kind of boring, but yeah. The only problem is that Totodile becomes a worse evolution because it evolves into Croconaut, and Croconaut is just not great. It does a lot more damage. I will say that if you want a DPS character for late game, Totodile becomes a lot better in the late game in terms of like you'll be doing more damage than Blastoise will be. but you'll also be tanking a lot less hits. Overall, Totodile is pretty much just in the shadow of Squirtle. There's really no benefit to picking Totodile over Squirtle, which really sucks because Totodile is such a cute Pokemon. Like, I love its design. I think it's a really well thought out Pokemon. It just doesn't have anything going for it, and that kind of sucks. It's not a terrible choice, but just be aware that there's essentially just a better choice. Mudkip is our next water type, and it ends up being a pretty interesting choice overall. I'm going to give Mudkip 4 stars. Mudkip's typing is exactly the same in the beginning as the other ones. It's good, water type's great. However, once it becomes its final evolution, its typing goes from really good to godlike, like top tier typing in the entire game. I'll get into why later, but it ends up being really good. Mudkip is a tank. He really doesn't do a ton of damage. He doesn't really support the team very well, but he's good at tanking hits, and you know, he's good at it. Mudkip has a better than average early game. It has a pretty interesting move pool. It doesn't really learn anything too crazy, and it has decent coverage with some ground moves, as in Mud Slap, but it's nothing really to write home about. It's just about as average as you can get. It's fine. Its bossing is honestly really average too. It's kind of the thing about a lot of the water types is they're all kind of tanky, so there's really not a lot to talk about in terms of their early game because they're all really similar. They're just solid choices overall, and they're pretty good at tanking. However, there's one category that Mudkip vastly outperforms the other two in a lot of different ways, is late game. So late game, it learns almost the exact same coverage moves. It learns Ice Beam, it learns Iron Tail. It doesn't learn Brick Break, which kind of sucks, but it learns Rock Tomb. It ends up getting some decent coverage. That's fine. However, Mudkip's final evolution is incredible. It evolves into Swampert, which becomes a ground type. And Water Ground is really, really good typing in this game. It ends up being really good against a lot of the Pokemon you're going to encounter. It removes its electric type weakness completely. It's pretty much just a huge benefit, honestly. It's only really weak against grass types, and grass types are really uncommon in a lot of the areas in the game. It would have been in the same category of 3-star as Totodile if it weren't for the fact it becomes a ground type, and Swampert ends up being a really tanky Pokemon. It's really good, honestly. If you like the Totodile playstyle of having a different water type than Squirtle and kind of messing around with some stuff, it ends up being a better late game choice. It's not the best choice you can make, but it's about average. It's pretty good. Thought we were done with water types, huh? Well, that's funny, because we're not. For some reason, they decided to add another water type to the roster, and it's really, really weird, because for fire types, you only have 3 different choices, for grass types, you only have 3 different choices, and for water types, you should only have 3 choices, because there's all of the starters from the 3 gens. For some reason, they put Psyduck in here. Psyduck is not my preferred Pokemon. I don't think it's a very good choice. It's going to barely get 2 stars. And I think that's maybe even a little bit of a stretch, and it's just because of a single factor I'll talk about in a minute. Psyduck's typing is fine, just like all the other water types. It's a good typing overall. I classified Psyduck as a support Pokemon, but I don't know. It's a really weird Pokemon because Psyduck's obviously not meant to do a lot of damage. It doesn't really learn a lot of damaging moves as it levels up, and it's not really meant to dish out a ton of damage. It's also not very tanky. So I guess you use it for support with Disable and maybe Confusion that can confuse your opponent, but overall, I don't know, it's kind of a support, but it doesn't really do its job perfectly. Okay, I'm going to go on a little bit of a tirade on this. Oh my god, it doesn't learn a water type move until level 50! What? How do you have a water type that doesn't learn a water type move until level 50? That makes no sense, because Water Sport, you can see there, doesn't do any damage. So you're literally using a water type that doesn't have a water type move the entire game. Why? Why would you ever use that? That's so bad. It has to use really crappy moves like Scratch and stuff like that. It eventually learns Confusion, which is a really nice move to have. Why would you ever use it? It doesn't make any sense. It has terrible move for early game. Its bossing is a little bit above average, but it's nothing to write home about because it doesn't really do a lot of damage. But it ends up being pretty useful with the Disable and Confusion. They kind of disable your opponent, but basically just kind of render your opponent a little bit immobile and basically kind of beat on it. It helps a little bit, but it's not anything amazing. Its move pool is actually above average. It's pretty good. It ends up finally learning some water type moves of water pulls and stuff like that. It can rain dance for your team. It gets Ice Beam, Iron Tail, Dig, Brick Break. It learns, you know, the normal coverage moves. It's fine. Its move pool late game is one of the only things that actually saves it, because Golduck is its final evolution. It's the first one-stage evolution Pokemon we've had so far, so all the other Pokemon in this game that we've seen so far can evolve 3 times, or I guess evolve twice, essentially. So for example, a Charmander, you can evolve into a Charmander, into a Charmeleon, and a Charmeleon into a Charizard, so it's a 3-stage evolution. Psyduck's only a 2-stage evolution, so it only evolves into Golduck And Golduck's not that great of a Pokemon, honestly. It's pretty average. I wouldn't really recommend it to anybody. Basically, my review of Psyduck is if you want a challenge, you can go for it. It's a really weird Pokemon. I will admit personally that Psyduck's one of the only Pokemon in the original games that I haven't actually used. I've never actually used one myself, but I've seen people do it and it really doesn't make that much sense. I would advise staying away from it. Now we begin the discussion of normal types in this game. There are about 3 or 4 different normal types in this game that you can use, and they all have their own little niche and kind of interesting thing about them. Meowth, I'm going to rate, honestly, I didn't know where to put him. He's somewhere in between 3 and 4 stars. I'm going to rate him 4 stars, but with a little bit of caution. I think he's not necessarily a 4-star level, but he's not as bad as a 3-star level. I would put him somewhere in the middle. Meowth's typing is as average as it gets. Normal type isn't really weak against much. It's also not really good against anything. It's average. Meowth is a DPS character. It's very straightforward. He has a very straightforward playstyle overall. You do lots of damage. That's it. That's your only goal. You don't disable the opponent. You don't tank anything. Meowth's one of the least tanky Pokemon in the entire game. However, he also has one of the highest damage outputs of anybody in the game. So if you want to do damage, there you go. Meowth has a surprisingly good move pool, and it's not good for coverage because it literally only learns normal and dark type moves. That's the only types of moves it can learn. However, so it's not very good coverage. However, it can learn really good moves. Bite is really, really solid overall. Feint Attack is a very good move overall. Fury Swipes is fantastic to have on him. Fake Out is a pretty interesting move overall, so it ends up learning pretty decent moves. It just doesn't have a lot of coverage. Its bossing is above average because it doesn't take a lot of hits, and we already know that, but it does a lot of damage, so it ends up kind of shredding through bosses. It's pretty good. Meowth's late game is a little bit crazy to say the least. It learns so many different types of moves. I mean, you can literally use this on so many different teams in so many different ways. So it learns for coverage as a normal type. It learns Water Pulse, Sunny Day, Rain Dance, so both of the dances you can have, or like the days, so you could have the fire type move increase or the water type move increase. It learns Iron Tail, Thunderbolt, Thunder, Dig, Shadow Ball. It's pretty crazy. It's a pretty interesting move pool overall. I don't know if you want to use any of those moves, but it has a really versatile move set. It's pretty interesting. Persian is its evolution. It's not great. It is really good damage. It can't take a hit, and that's pretty much the story of Meowth, is that it's very, very weak in terms of getting hit, but it does a lot of damage, so if you're into that, go for it. Overall, I rate Meowth in somewhere between the 3 and 4 star range because it's fine, it's good. If you want to do lots of damage and you want no nonsense, you don't want any of this elemental stuff, you just want to do some damage, pick Meowth, it's fine. I forgot to mention this again really quick, I keep forgetting. Meowth is only for males. Our next Pokemon is Eevee. I don't have a lot of good things to say about it, and I'm pretty sad. You have to be a female to use Eevee. Eevee is I believe the only Pokemon in the entire list we are rating at 1 star. Just like before, its average typing, it's fine. It's normal type. It's great. I'm going to be talking about its typing later specifically, and obviously because they become a lot of different types. Eevee's gimmick is Eevee can evolve into a bunch of different types of Pokemon. In the current games, it can evolve into 8 different types of Pokemon. It's pretty crazy. It's a really versatile Pokemon. It's super popular and ends up being really neat for your team because it can basically cover whatever kind of weakness you need. Like you need a Psychic type? Okay, evolve into an Espeon. Oh, you really need an Electric type? You have Jolteon. It's pretty interesting. And the main problem is I don't understand why they did this. You can't evolve it until late game. So why have a Pokemon that's so focused on the evolution factor? That's the main gimmick of Eevee, is it can evolve into so many Pokemon. You can't do that for half the game. So it ends up just being a useless Pokemon. I didn't really have a role to put it because it doesn't really do anything. It doesn't really tank, it doesn't really support, and it doesn't do a lot of damage. Depending on the evolution you choose, it can become a lot of different types of Pokemon with different playstyles, but it's really not great. Most of them just end up being DPS overall. The only one that's kind of tanky is Umbreon, and the other ones are all pretty much DPS. Actually, Vaporeon's kind of a tank also, but overall, it's just meh. Its boss matchups are weak because it doesn't really do anything that any other Pokemon doesn't do. Helping Hand is pretty useful overall, but it just, why not just use a Pokemon that does a move? It doesn't really make sense to me. Its late game is obviously bad because you're not supposed to use it late game. You're supposed to evolve it into something else and make it kind of interesting. so obviously you're not going to use Eevee late game. However, the one interesting thing about Eevee is you can make it a lot of different types of Pokemon. So if you wanted to have an Espeon, for example, it's a pretty interesting type. If you didn't want an Umbreon or an Espeon late game, there is, in my opinion, zero reason to choose Eevee. If you wanted a Flareon, that makes no sense. Just choose a fire type, because it can become, Eevee can become 5 different types of Pokemon in this game. It can become a Jolteon, a Vaporeon, a Flareon, an Espeon, and an Umbreon. That ends up being fire, electric, water, dark, and psychic, depending on what you want. However, if you wanted any of the first 3, which is fire, electric, and water, why not just choose one that's already a fire, electric, and water? Spoiler alert, there's an electric type coming up. But why not just choose that Pokemon so you can have that the entire game? Why wait until you beat the game to get an average Pokemon? It doesn't really make a lot of sense. The only interesting thing I can see about this is if you really wanted to have a starter Umbreon or an Espeon, because there is no dark type or psychic type starter in this game. So that's kind of an interesting choice, but I don't think it's worth raising an Eevee to do so. Overall, Eevee is just not a very good fit for Mystery Dungeon. I think, personally, Eevee is one of my favorite Pokemon. I think Eevee is a very interesting Pokemon. It's a really cool idea for a Pokemon because it's so versatile, it can become so many different things, and it's so cool, but it doesn't fit the Mystery Dungeon formula at all, in my opinion. I would pass as fast as you can on Eevee. The next Pokemon we're going to be talking about today is easily one of the Pokemon I have the most to say, and it's really interesting. So you're probably looking at this jumbled mess on the screen like, what just happened to the layout? Why is it so crazy now? Skitty has so many interesting elements that I wanted to talk about that makes it a really unique Pokemon and a really cool choice. I'm going to be giving Skitty, believe it or not, 5 stars, and I have a specific reason for this that is different compared to the other games in the series. For example, the other later Mystery Dungeon games, Skitty's not as good. In this game, I think Skitty's 5 stars. Skitty is a normal type. It's just about as average as you can get. Nothing crazy here. It's normal type. It's great. Skitty does have a gender requirement. You need to be a female to use it. Remember when I mentioned earlier in this video, a long time ago, that I mentioned that most of the abilities are completely irrelevant on most of the Pokemon? This is the one exception. Its ability, as you can see in the middle of your screen, is Cute Charm. When a Pokemon makes contact with Skitty, it has a 30% chance of being infatuated and not being able to do anything. Now that's great and all, because it has to be the opposite gender, so that ends up not being very useful in a lot of the actual gameplay itself, like their main Pokemon game. However, in Mystery Dungeon, specifically the first one, which is one we're playing right now, Mystery Dungeon Red and Blue, there is no genders on Pokemon. So this means that any Pokemon that comes in contact with Skitty has a 30% chance of getting infatuated and not being able to do anything. That's humongous. That's a really big benefit. So literally, if anyone attacks you, they have an automatic 3 out of 10 roll to just not do anything for the next turn. You have a 3 out of 10 chance to just disable them. And that's really strong. That's a really cool thing overall. Contact is also included in the just A button. So you know how if you tap the A button, you do a normal attack. This counts for Cute Charm. The problem is, in the later Pokemon Mystery Dungeon games, they actually added genders to every Pokemon. So it's not as useful of an ability because there's like a pretty decent chance that your Pokemon won't get infatuated with you. In this game, any Pokemon can. So it's great. Skitty is honestly, it's one of the most versatile Pokemon in the game. I put it as a DPS and support because it can fill both the roles very, very nicely. It can do lots and lots of damage with its crazy move pool, and it also has a very good supportive move pool with that. Okay, this is where I talk about the early game, but this move pool, do you see this? I didn't have enough room to just have both of the columns. I had to break it up because it has such a huge amount of moves it can learn. The bottom left is the level up one. That's what we're going to be using for the early game. Its early game is good. It has a very crazy moveset with just a lot of different types of moves, and it's pretty interesting. It's kind of like a poor man's Meowth, but it's a lot more supportive. So early game, it's not a damage character. It can do a decent amount of damage with certain moves, like Double Slap is a really, really good DPS move, and it can learn Feint Attack with an okay coverage, but DPS is not why you pick it. Early game, it's a lot more of a support Pokemon, so it can sing to put Pokemon to sleep. It can use Assist to randomly use an ally's move, so that means you might be able to get Smokescreen or something if you have that on your team. Charm ends up really reducing a lot of other Pokemon's effectiveness at bossing and stuff like that. Covet can steal items that opponents have, and Heal Bell can just heal your team. So it has a very supportive move pool and actually a pretty interesting move pool overall. Against bosses, it's not bad because it has a lot of supportive moves and ends up helping a lot. It also does a decent amount of damage, so it ends up being a really good boss overall. Skitty's late game is crazy. I mean, you can see the top right. I don't need to like say it out for you. That is the craziest move pool I have ever seen. it learns so much stuff. So on top of all of the moves in the bottom left that we already talked about that are really interesting on it, for coverage, it's really similar to Meowth. It ends up getting Water Pulse. It has Sunny Day Rain Dance, that combo as well for any of your team members. It has Ice Beam. It has Safeguard. It has Solar Beam. Imagine a Skitty with Solar Beam. It can learn Iron Tail, Thunderbolt, and Thunder, Dig, Shadow Ball, Shockwave. It's pretty crazy how much coverage this Pokemon gets. It can just cover any weakness that you have on your team. One of the only reasons I was really hesitant to put Skitty in the 5-star category is its evolution. Because when all of the Pokemon are compared to each other, like all of the starter Pokemon are paired up, like none of them are amazing. So Skitty doesn't really stand out as a particularly weak Pokemon. However, its evolution Delcatty doesn't really get anything good. Delcatty is a very weak Pokemon overall, and so it has a crazy move pool to use with it, but it ends up being a lot worse late game. It's still very supportive and it can cover a lot of its weaknesses, but Delcatty doesn't help it a lot. It's not a very good evolution. So I was really deciding on whether or not to put this in the 5-star category. I think I'm going to keep it there because of just how versatile it is and how interesting it is, but I definitely would be careful about using it because it's not a very good Pokemon for beginners because it's so crazy. It's a really interesting choice, but just be careful when picking it, honestly. But have fun though, it's really interesting. Okay, we are finally out of the normal types, so now we're on to Pokemon that have a very specific typing that no other Pokemon in the game has. Pikachu is the only electric type starter you can choose. It is also the only one that can be paired with any other Pokemon, which makes it a pretty interesting choice because if you wanted to, you can always have Pikachu as your partner if you wanted to. I'm going to kind of hesitantly give Pikachu 5 stars. I know that's kind of a big claim, but I think Pikachu has enough elements going for it that makes it a really solid choice overall. Pikachu stays an electric type its entire evolution line, and it's good. Electric typing ends up being pretty useful for this game. It has a weakness against ground types, but overall, it's a pretty solid typing. It doesn't really have a lot of weaknesses, it's just a pretty good typing overall. I classified Pikachu as a DPS / support, because it's clearly meant to do lots of damage, because it's really fast and just ends up blasting your opponent with Thunderbolts and stuff like that, but it has a surprisingly really supportive move pool. So it ends up getting a lot of stuff like Thunder Wave to disable the opponent, it can use Double Team to raise its evasiveness and not get hit, and agility to go faster. It can set up Light Screen. It only has Light Screen, it doesn't have Reflect, but it ends up having a pretty decent support move pool. So it ends up being a pretty interesting Pokemon overall. One of the main reasons I put Pikachu at 5 stars is its early game move pool is amazing. This is the pinnacle of what you want for an early game move pool. It's like rivaling Charmander. Honestly, I might even call this a better move pool. So it starts out with both Thunder Shock and Growl, which is pretty good overall. It gets Thunder Wave at level 8 to disable any bosses you can fight. Quick Attack is a good ranged move. Double Team can make it dodge a ton of different opponents. Thunderbolt is amazing for doing tons of damage. Agility can speed it up. Thunder is a really interesting move, and Light Screen's good. It just has a very good move pool overall. Pikachu is also amazing early game because it matches up incredibly well against the bosses in this game. I don't want to have any spoilers, as I'm not going to actually say what you're fighting. A very consistent trio of Pokemon, and Pikachu blasts every single one of them out of the water. It's really, really good. And Pikachu's reign doesn't stop there. Pikachu has a really solid move pool. So it has, one of the best things about Pikachu is that for late game is that it has Rain Dance. And Rain Dance makes Thunder 100% accurate. So that means that you can just use Rain Dance and then just Thunder everything and just blast everything out of the water if you really wanted to. It also learns really interesting coverage with stuff like Focus Punch, Iron Tail, Dig, and Brick Break. So it ends up having a pretty good move pool overall. This is the only category where I was a little bit concerned about putting it 5 star, but I'm going to keep it there. Raichu is a good evolution, but it's nothing incredible. It's about average. It's nothing really to write home about, but it's certainly not a bad evolution. One of the only negative points I had to say about Pikachu is that Raichu is not the most incredible evolution ever, but it's nothing to write home about, but with all of the other amazing points it has, I think it's pretty hard to overlook it. Overall, if you want a really, really good Pokemon for your team, it can fit in any team. It can literally join your team no matter what your Pokemon is. It's a really solid Pokemon. The next Pokemon we're going to be talking about today is Cubone. Cubone is a pretty interesting Pokemon overall. I don't think it's very amazing, but it has something going for it. I'm going to give Cubone 2 stars. Let's start at the beginning. Cubone's typing is okay. Ground type is a decent typing overall. It's immune to electric attacks, so that makes it pretty good, but it's really nothing to write home about. It's just not great. It has a lot of weaknesses in terms of being against water and grass, and you fight quite a bit of water in this game, so I classified Cubone as a DPS tank because it doesn't really... The problem with Cubone is it doesn't have a very defined role in the game. Like certain Pokemon you look at and you're like, oh, you are a DPS character, or it's like, oh, Chikorita, okay, you're a support character, you want to help your team. And Cubone doesn't really have a very specific role. It kind of just goes around and slams stuff with its bones, and I mean, that's pretty much it, honestly. It does a decent damage output, and it's okay at tanking physical moves, but it's nothing really incredible. Like most of Cubone, its move pool early game is pretty average. It's not particularly amazing against anything. It's pretty good against a lot of the fire types you fight, but I mean, it's just not that great. It doesn't really learn a lot of coverage. It's very similar to Cyndaquil if you were kind of thinking in that vein of it doesn't really have a lot of coverage. It's just good at blasting things with ground type moves. That's it. Cubone's bossing is also really weak because I don't want to say spoilers, but you fight a trio and basically, let's say it like this, ground type moves aren't very good against them. So he doesn't have the greatest boss matchups in the world. He has really nothing to actually disable his opponent. So he just ends up being kind of meh against most of the bosses in this game. He also has a weakness against a lot of them in general. His late game's alright, but a lot of the coverage he learns doesn't really help him that much. He learns stuff like Focus Punch, which is really nice. Sunny Day is pretty nice if you can combo that with a lot of your fire types if you have any. And it can learn Ice Beam for some reason. It learns a lot of moves that would theoretically be good, except that it's not really built to shoot Ice Beams. Earthquake is a fantastic move to have though. Iron Tail, Dig, and Brick Break are all really solid moves to have. It also learns Flamethrower, interestingly enough, and also learns Rock Tomb and Aerial Ace. So its late game coverage is above average. It's pretty good, but at that point you're like, why would you even use it when you had to go through the really crappy early game? Its evolution is also one of its really weak points, is that its evolution is fine. It evolves into Marowak. It gets some more damage, and that's honestly it. It's not even that much tankier. Overall, I would not recommend Cubone to a lot of people. It's a pretty interesting Pokemon, but it's nothing to write home about. It's pretty average. It's below average, I'd say, actually. I wouldn't even give it the benefit of being average. I think it's just a below average Pokemon overall. I would steer clear from this one. Last Pokemon I'm going to be talking about today is one that's pretty interesting. So I didn't really know what to do for fighting types, so I kind of just put in a real gem behind it. The last Pokemon we have today is Machop. Machop can only be male, so you have to be using a male to use this Pokemon. I'm going to be giving Machop 3 stars, although I think you might be able to stretch this out to 4, but I'm going to leave it at 3 for now. Machop's pretty funny actually because he's one of the only kind of average Pokemon that's not just a fire, water, or grass type, because the other ones have been very polarizing. It's either really good or really bad. So having Machop just kind of equalizing out, kind of a good way to end in my opinion. Machop is clearly meant to be a DPS character. He has no supportive abilities. He has Scary Face, but he's not a support Pokemon. He also doesn't really do that much tanking. You're meant to just smack stuff as hard as you can. His early game move pool is very limited, but impressive. That's the best way I have to describe it, is that he learns very good moves. It's a lot of really insane fighting type moves that helps it a lot, and it learns some pretty decent moves overall, but the problem is, you literally only learn fighting type moves. You don't learn anything else. So it's really hard to use it in the early game because you have nothing to cover any other weaknesses. It's just a fighting type. You can only punch stuff. So what happens if you go against a bird, like a flying type? It sucks, right? Like, that's the main weakness of Machop, is its early game. This is what's holding it back, in my opinion, from being a 4-star or even a 5-star, is that its early game is just really not good. Its boss matchups overall are not terrible. It's fine. It's about average. It's not great against, you know, the trio that I keep talking about, but overall it's pretty decent. This is the main reason why I have not put it in the dumpster, however. Machop is easily one of the best late game Mon you can pick. There's not a lot of better picks, honestly. He's very similar to Treecko in certain ways like that. I think, in my personal opinion, Machop is the hardest Pokemon to use early game because of its extremely limited move pool and not really tanky stats, but it ends up evolving into a monster and getting really nice moves. It gets amazing coverage. It gets both Sunny Day and Rain Dance to combo with your other Pokemon. It learns Bulk Up, which is a really nice boosting move overall. It learns different punching moves. It learns Earthquake, Dig, it learns Flamethrower, it learns Rock Tomb. It has really good coverage overall, and it ends up helping it quite a bit. Its final evolution, Machamp, is easily one of the best Pokemon, one of the best starter evolutions in the game. I'd argue it's honestly one of the best behind maybe Charizard and maybe a few others, but it's really solid overall. Machop ends up being an average Pokemon by equalization, essentially. What I mean by that is, it has a trash early game, but it has a really good late game. So, It's a very average Pokemon overall. You're going to have a pretty interesting experience with it. I think it's a very interesting choice, to say the least. I think I would consider trying it. It's a pretty interesting Pokemon overall, but don't expect anything too crazy, especially early. Late game, expect lots of things to get punched. Hey everybody, it's Just101. I wanted to add some post editing to say thank you so much for watching. If you could leave a like and subscribe, I would appreciate that so much. This video took so long to make. It took me about 3 days to make. I will see you all next time.